Well, I was interested to hear Katie talk about the millennial mixer. I noticed we don't have a whole lot of young people in the room, so it must have been quite a party last night. Well, first of all, before we get started, I do want to congratulate Loman and the whole Pennsylvania Leadership Conference on 30 years of great success, of bringing folks together to drive conservative principles and conservative change in Pennsylvania. It's a great year to be involved. So with that, I'll introduce our panel this morning, which is called Winning Hearts and Minds. And we're going to talk about really how to engage people who aren't in this room on the issues that we care about. So before I get started, I'll introduce our panel. First, we have Matt Batzel. He's a Pennsylvania native, the National Executive Director of American Majority. In that role, Matt trains candidates to run for office, to engage people during election season. He also started the Wisconsin chapter of American Majority that had great success just recently in a Supreme Court race, so hopefully you'll talk to us about that. Next to Matt is Lois. Many of you know Lois. She is a citizen activist who has been engaged in causes and policy and elections for quite some time. She's got a lot to share in terms of what that looks like, because it's not enough to talk about these issues, but we've got to talk to people where they are in their communities to drive change. So we'll hear from Lois. Next to Lois is Conor Maguire, the most, sorry, my tag there. I think the most interesting thing that you guys would like to know about Conor is he was instrumental in the 2016 presidential race, using data and analytics to help President Trump in his election. Conor comes to us from WPA Intelligence, where he is a senior client strategist, really working with clients through data and analysis, really innovative opportunities to drive the discussion, to look at elections through data. So we'll hear from Conor here in a minute. And then we have Mitchell Snyder, who is going to law school soon in Dickinson Law School. We're not going to hold that against him, Mel. He's chairman of the Pennsylvania Federation of College Republicans, an important voice in this discussion. He's currently in college getting a degree in both economics and law and policy with a minor in political science. So Mitchell definitely spends way too much time studying.
Just a little.
And clearly managed to get to bed early enough to not stay out too late at the Millennial Mixer to be here with us this morning. Okay, so as we get started, one of the things we talked about in putting together this panel is that it feels like, and Kimberly Strassel talked about this last night as well, it feels like while we know why free markets and free people drive the most success for every single citizen across our country, we're starting to have a different conversation. Because a lot of people don't come to those ideas naturally, right? And so what we wanted to find out was what's the best way to engage people who don't know that free markets and free people create the most success and prosperity across our country. So I want to start with Conor, who really does dig down into the data, really get a feel for what people are talking about, who is having this discussion, who we need to be talking to, and what's the best way to engage them. So Conor, why don't you give us the kind of big picture landscape?
Sure, great, thanks. So what I focus on is data, and the firm that I work with, we use both polling and analytics to really take an analysis and deep dive and everything. It's really great because the polling provides you the strategic side of things, what are we going to talk about and how are we going to talk about this message. And then the analytics side, the big data that we use, really is the tactical side. Who do we talk to on a daily basis, and what specific message do we deliver to that person? I think that's something that we really need to change more as campaigns move and evolve, is getting more into talking to a specific person about a specific thing. Make a decision to talk to them because we know information about them and what we want to talk to them about. So we really dig down and take a look at how people change, how people move, and really develop that whole program. one of the things we do is when we collect data, this becomes the real tough thing. Data's come a long way in politics, but what we really have to do is find a way to actually get to the truth of what people actually believe, what's actually going to move them on the spectrum. One of these things that we deal with quite a bit is stated bias. So people don't really know what they believe and what's going to move them on an issue. So we really have to set up a structure that when we ask them questions and collect data from them, we kind of ask them how they feel about an issue, then we read them some messages, some of these messages that our campaigns are going to use out in the field when we're knocking doors, when we're running TV ads, and then we're going to ask them the same question. And then we'll see how they moved on that structure to see what actually got someone to move. So instead of just trusting someone and say, oh, well, the most important thing to me is infrastructure. That may be very important to them, but that may not be the actual thing that gets them to move, actually vote for the candidates that are going to put forth these types of policies that we agree with. So we really have to dig down to that, which has become very helpful to be able to deliver the right message about tax policy, about free, smaller government, which then actually is going to get someone to actually vote for the candidate that will produce these policies.
Great, yeah, that sounds important because we find this too at AFP when we call people on surveys and we say, do you care about X?
Of course.
Yeah, of course.
Everyone says they care about
right?
everything.
But then when you say, well, here's what they're proposing in Harrisburg, it's like, oh no, actually, that's fine by me. So you really do have to dig down like that. Now, Matt, you guys take the data and work with candidates running for office. So talk a little bit about what that looks like and how you help candidates have these conversations.
Yeah, well, for candidates, we want them to tell a story, tell their story, and talk to voters in a way that shows them what they have in common with the voters. So voters are, motivated by many different issues, will change who they're going to support based upon a number of different things. But for candidates themselves, they need to find the common values that they have with individuals all across the political spectrum in different demographics, different geography, different parts, rural, urban, suburban. They need to be able to connect with those voters and show them how they're going to be an advocate for them. They're going to fight for their values. They're going to stand up for those shared values that they have. And so, for candidates, we train them extensively on, okay, think about who you are, just, and analyze what you've done. Don't just assume that people know who you are because you're been in your community for many years. You need to tell them what you've done. You need to show how you've cared. And caring is such an important thing that you actually listen to what the voters are saying when door-to-door candidates asking what issue is most important to you, that you're actually listening to them. You're not just thinking about something else, but you're listening and you're talking. You're finding that common ground that you have with a particular voter, whether it be at their door or you're speaking to a group of teachers or a pro-life group, whatever it may be. You want to show them how you're going to be a vehicle for them to bring about change and stand up for their values. And so it's so important that candidates tell stories, right? So often we talk as accountants or we look at numbers and figures, and data is helpful to analyze this stuff, but we need to use emotion, and storytelling is a way to bring that emotion forth and connect with voters and then motivate them to take an action and appeal to their heart to take action and ultimately vote for a candidate, but also support a policy, make an action, maybe call an elected official, tell them that you support something. And so it's so important that we tell stories, that we make that emotional appeal and connect to their heart.
Do you find that when you're training candidates who really, do have a lot of experience, maybe they're county commissioners already, or they've had experience in the community, that teaching people about that emotion and connection piece is difficult?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, so often when you have an elected official, they won an election through a process that may have been effective in what they campaigned on and how they campaigned. It may not have been, right? So they may have just been the most popular person in their community and they got elected because of that. They might have gone out and done, a bunch of fundraisers. They might not have knocked on many doors. They might have run some TV ads. They may not have, right? So, but they think that whatever they did was the key to their success. And so to come in and tell them sometimes that you need to do something different, or you need to think about, talking and appealing to emotion, telling stories, it is difficult. But most people that recognize that it's not just simply doing what you've done in the past, but you need to continually sharpen your game and improve your skills. And if you're going to get reelected, if you maybe have a challenger who's difficult or who's doing something very well, you need to look at, okay, what do we need to do? How do we tell a story, or how do we communicate message better. Because in some ways, too, as an elected official, if you've been there, you've done something. So you have a record to run on. How do you talk about that record and what you stood for, the votes that you've taken? How do you defend those actions and say that you should be rehired or warrant this happening? So yeah, sometimes it is training people that are reluctant to change or reluctant to hear new things. But it's important that we always are learning and analyzing what is working, what's not, and improving. And as conservatives, making sure that we have smart campaigns, we're doing the right things, we're motivating the right voters, and we're ultimately winning.
Great. Mitchell, I see you shaking your head at smart campaigns and engaging well. So I'm kind of curious to ask you, as a young college student, how you came to these ideas, and then how you sort of brought that to the college Republicans, how you want to engage your peers and generational cohorts around these issues.
Sure. So one of the best parts of my job as chairman is I get to go around and talk to college students, both who agree with us and who don't. And one of the things that we're finding that's very common is a lot of young people just don't understand some of the history, both of things like socialism, for example. And it's because the stories that they're hearing aren't being told. The stories that I heard from my parents, which really I think shaped my views, and the things that I've experienced and how I was raised and the experiences I've had, aren't necessarily being translated to everyone in my age group. And I think that's because a lot of what the Republican Party does, and we're very good at it, is we're making arguments based on facts. And that is fantastic when you have people who are agreeing with your opinions. But what we're seeing is a lot of people are forming their opinions, especially younger people, based on emotion first. And I think where Democrats are really beating us out there is on storytelling. We need to be able to tell a story behind a policy. So if you think back to the midterm election, you heard about health care, I think, pretty more than any issue across the country. Democrats were putting out ads showing people's parents, showing young children, and a lot of what we heard was policy response. And that's great. Policy is really why we're in this. At the end of the day, we get candidates elected to get those policies put into place. But if we want to get young voters to, I think, support those things, we have to start telling the stories behind them. We have to highlight the family who, with rising Obama care premiums, wasn't able to afford to keep their house. We need to highlight where socialism has failed both historically and in our own country. And we need to be able to tell those stories in a way that they relate to those voters, but that they also are able to understand the truth behind that. Tax reform is another great one. We saw that benefit families across the board. All income levels, specifically middle-class families taking home thousands of dollars in their paycheck that they didn't previously get, but we don't see those stories being told, how that helps a family. And I think especially when dealing with young voters, it's telling the stories in their entirety, showing the human effect, because we make I think we form our opinions on policy, on parties, on political candidates, on these issues, often based on emotion, because we care. Mm-hmm. Everyone cares. We don't want to see someone get hurt. And then we confirm them with the factual information. And it's very hard to go up to young people and say, well, that policy didn't work, when they're convinced that it's an absolute must to help everybody, and that there's not a good alternative because of the stories they've heard and the people that they've been highlighted by our opposition in that way. So I think that's really what it comes down to, is telling effective stories about the policy. And whether that's stories from a candidate's personal experience, like Matt was talking about, or stories from individual constituents that help shape those opinions, I think that's where we can make the most progress with young voters.
Yeah, so I said to you earlier, I have a theory that we tend to talk about policies like it's 1983, right? But for people like Mitchell, the entire economic environment is different than it was in 1983.
And that's before he was born.
Yes, and that was...
I was born in 83. So
okay, and Matt too, my gosh. No, and I was in high school in 1983. So, and I have a 14-year-old son, and I had him here last night, and Kimberly Strassel was talking about, young people have so much individual freedom to chart their own careers, chart their own lives, chart their own paths. They don't know any different from that. And so when somebody talks about socialism, right, that sounds fair, right? That sounds right. And what young people don't tend to realize is that you can't have the life you have now with the choices and freedom you have and have that at the same time. So what do you experience when you're talking to college students who just simply think you're wrong?
So it's always fun, because it always starts out way more aggressive than it ever needed to be. So often the first step is to get them to calm down just enough to have a conversation. But the first steps, and I think this is where where we take it is talking about things without mentioning socialism, without mentioning Republicans or Democrats, talking to them about what they believe in. Because what you find is when you talk with a lot of young people, they believe in personal freedom. They don't want to have their freedoms taken away. They don't want to have, government dealing with this, that, or the other. But what they don't understand is that's what a lot of these policies are advocating for. So that's really where you need to start. And I think it's talking and finding that common ground at that core value level. We all want to be free. We all want to be able to have more money in our paychecks. We all want to be able to graduate and get a job. And then it's moving from that and saying, okay, now how can we best do that? And I think that's the first steps that you can take, and that's what I've done in my conversations with people.
Great, great. Lois, so I had a conversation with you early on, and we talked about the fact that you can, kind of have all the best messages, but you need to think about who you're talking to and meeting people where they are in their community. Right. And that's what you do on the issues that you care about. So talk to us a little bit about what that looks like,
Sure.
When you're trying to engage citizen to citizen.
Sure. And I just want to shift a little bit because I tend to look at things in terms of elections, not necessarily specific issues.
Sure.
And when you're trying to get your candidate elected, it's not necessarily the same thing as talking to people about a specific issue, even though that issue is most important to you. But in order to get your candidate elected, even if that's your perfect candidate, you've got to get other people to vote for that candidate because it's important. Whatever is important to them is going to motivate them to vote for your candidate. So you can't do that by necessarily talking about what's important to you. You have to find out what's important to that person and appeal to them on what's important to them. And I've noticed that, we make that mistake when we start out, like in politics and in advocating for a candidate, by saying what's so great about the candidate based on what we think is important without finding out what's important to the person who we're talking to. And it's really, and if you take the time to talk to your neighbors, and especially if you knock on doors during campaign season, which I highly recommend, it is an extremely effective way of getting people out to vote and getting them engaged, especially in this off-year election. Most of your neighbors will not be voting. So if you want to change that, it would be helpful to at least go talk to them about why this election is important, and judges are important, school board members are important, their local borough council or township supervisors. These are all important races. And to go talk to them about and find out what they're thinking about. But if you can find out what's important to your neighbors, then you have a place to start. But you don't have a place to start if you don't know what's important to them. And I give you an example, Beth Ann, because I walk my neighborhood every election and I talk to my neighbors. And when you go to people on their own property, there's a different kind of feel that goes on with talking to people, is that they're more likely to be forthright with you about what they're feeling and what they think than if you run into them in another social situation. So I'll go and talk to my neighbors, and I've had some very interesting conversations, and I'm going to Republicans in primaries, so sometimes we think that, well, just because we're all Republicans, we all believe the same things, but we actually don't. And so you have to listen to people and see what they say, and a while back we were having issues with Second Amendment, Toomey Manchin bill, and a lot of Second Amendment supporters were not happy with that. And it's very easy to go and start that conversation, but if you weren't listening to who you were talking to, and a neighbor of mine, we were just chatting, and I was going around for election time, and he brought the subject up about gun control. And he thought that these regulations were perfectly reasonable, and there are a number of Republican voters that do think these regulations are reasonable. So I made a big note in my head that when I'm going and talking to this particular voter, that Second Amendment issues are not what's important to him. So if I'm trying to get votes, that was an important thing for me to know about that voter. And if you can learn those things about your neighbors, you can get votes for your candidates without making a mistake about talking about something that they don't care about. And I've made that mistake, so I know. But you don't know until you talk to individual voters what's important to them, and then you can start to have a conversation, from there.
Yeah, and that goes back to Conor, where you started, right? She's doing that organically in her neighborhood. You do that on a much larger scale.
And we're trying to take the guesswork out of that. So you kind of give you a little bit more ammunition before you go to that door. So you know a little bit more about who you're about to talk to. So you can start that conversation off the right step. But you're so right. People, just because some people are of one party doesn't mean they all believe the same thing. Right. And people's minds change and their opinions change. In 2006, 91% of Americans were satisfied with their freedoms here, with their individual freedoms. Now it's down to 75%. These things change, and it's always adjusting. So as we're going knocking on doors, preparing campaigns, we always have to remember this and change our targeting. Targeting is a fluid thing. It will change as different issues come up, as different politicians take different sides and different positions. We have to make sure that we're always keeping up on that and keeping our research fresh. So always updating your data, making sure you know where you're going to go next, and that tactical side of things is so important. With things changing, and if you take a look at just, when you take a look at how people view individual freedoms, as well as economic growth possibilities, you can see just different on party lines things split pretty well. So it's about 30% more Republicans believe that they're more satisfied with and think we have the best individual freedoms in the world. But when you break that down even more, you see even more divisions that we have to make sure that we are accounting for. Because the worst thing is going to a door and talking about something that's really going to turn off a voter. So making sure we're talking about something that really matters to them and is going to drive them in the right direction is extremely important.
Great. Just to remind everybody, if you do have questions for the panelists, write them down and Dan will bring them over so we can make sure that we get your questions answered. But I do have one that I think is really interesting. It's directed to Mitch, but I'd like Matt to weigh in too. Please give a short example of a good story to make a point.
You want to go first, Matt? Or?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the Wisconsin Supreme Court election that we just had on Tuesday. Wisconsin, we have nonpartisan judges that are up, and conservatives controlled the Supreme Court 4-3, but there's a fear that we were going to lose the control of the Supreme Court with this election in 2019, and then 2020 coincides, the Supreme Court election coincides with the presidential primary, so there was a lot of fear that the turnout for the Democratic primary would overwhelm the conservative justice and we could lose the court in one election. And so the conservative judge Brian Hagedorn was running, and he opened up his whole campaign with an ad talking about how he had adopted his youngest child, who was an infant and was addicted to opioids. The mother, the birth mother, had to give up the child. And it was just a really compelling ad that told the story. I'm an adoptive father as well, and so to me it touched my heart and really got me emotional watching it. But it was something that touched on an issue that a lot of people care about, the drug problem, drug overdoses, opioid problem. But he was able to tell it in a way that showed that he cared. And so oftentimes, as candidates, and maybe think about justice, what should they be focused on? Well, rule of law, following the Constitution, things like that. But for a judge, it was important that he showed that he was human, right? Not just this technocrat who looks at the law and doesn't really care about the people that are before him or the cases that are before him and the people behind the cases. And so this was just a really good example of how he told a story and had his wife involved in it. And it was very humanizing. And I think as conservatives especially, we can kind of be scripted in thinking about numbers and solutions. But this was a way to just humanize and tell a story about how this judge cares about people.
Sure, so going off of that, that's I think a really great example of working with a candidate. I want to take a policy issue example too. Let's talk about prison reform. We had the First Step Act. That was one of a major bipartisan piece of legislation that moved through Congress. And I think if you looked at the messaging for that, it was done really effectively across party lines. They were taking examples of individuals who had either been incarcerated for significant periods of time for minor offenses, looking at how it's affected them going out, being unable to get work, being unable to do these things. And I think it's those human examples, humanizing it, as Matt just pointed out, that really bring people in and get them comfortable with addressing maybe solutions or topics or policy they might not initially be open to. Showing the human side of it, how it can help people, how an issue may have hurt somebody and how they can do it. How we talk about Obamacare, how the premiums have gone up and people are being unable to afford it. How they can't go to the doctors that they're comfortable with or the people that they prefer to go to because of this regulation when they were told something completely different. How tax reform gave them enough money to maybe go out and try a new activity, do something new for their family, get something additional that's good for them. Those types of examples that are humanizing, they're relatable, and they put a human face on a policy issue that otherwise we're talking about stats, we're talking about data, that's a lot easier to shrug off when you disagree with the policy. You know, if you disagree with tax reform being a good thing, it's really easy to say, okay, let's not care about it, let's not talk about it, I don't care what those statistics say, it's bad, it's just for the, the really rich people, it's fine. But when you start giving them human examples, it's much harder to shrug off and it's much harder to disregard.
Yeah, absolutely. Conor.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that's one thing I love, how data can now help build out those stories and highlight the stories that we should be talking about. In North Dakota for Kevin Kramer, we noticed a lot of our message testing that we were doing, data that we were collecting, was that pro-life was a very strong, important message that we really needed to make sure we spoke about. So we cut just a wonderful ad with the candidates' daughters and talking about why they are pro-life and their faith and their lives. And that ad was one of our better testing ads. It did a very great job. And then you couple that with Heidi Heitkamp high-fiving Schumer on the Senate floor. It really put together this narrative about values and about what the family cared about, and it really related very well on an individual level to voters.
Yeah, and I think that goes a little bit to what Lois was saying. Sometimes we assume that others think and feel like we think, right? And one of the things that intrigues me about the data is sometimes you find something surprising. You didn't even know that people were motivated by this particular issue or cared about this particular issue. And that has really changed the way campaigns and candidates have been able to operate. You know, we all knew that the Obama operation was really good at using that data to individualize their connections with individual voters. So how has that changed this landscape for candidates and for elections, Conor?
So one of the things we take a look at is you don't make a decision just because it's your gut and you think, oh, this is what people want to hear. You actually make a decision based on that data that we collect. And sometimes when you get attacked on a campaign, your first reaction is always just to go back and refute it. But if you're explaining, you're losing. What we direct our candidates more to do is, let's take a look at the issues that are people that supposedly this issue would hurt us the most with, what do they actually care about the most? And let's talk about that issue. So if something comes at us about, about maybe some regulations or some issue, let's actually not talk about that. Let's talk about this pro-life issue. Let's talk about cutting taxes here. Let's talk about making more resources available to farmers. That's what we should be talking about, instead of immediately knee-jerk reaction going to whatever we've been hit on from our opponents.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a great question here, and I'd like everybody to weigh in. Innovations in data have created the opportunity through social media to engage voters one-on-one, right? Yep. And there are some candidates who do that really, really well. In particular, Mitchell, your cohorts, that's, most folks are online. It's the best way to, sometimes you can't find them at the door, they don't have phones, they're not watching TV. So how do you convince candidates that social media, or what can that look like in a campaign for engaging, whether election time or on issues?
Sure, I'll go first.
Yeah.
One of the things we've noticed, and I've noticed specifically with either candidates whose campaigns I've worked on or I've been following closely, is some of the best social media posts I see, number one, are personal, whether it's a personal video, a live stream video, them talking with the voters, or they're a little bit more funny. And that shares well. People are excited to share it. If there's a long, post talking about a policy, people really aren't that interested in sharing that. Several people might read it, but it's those engageable content. Videos, short, engaging, personal. And I keep coming back to that word personal because I think that's a lot about what social media is, and I hate to use her as an example, but AOC does a great job being personable. Personally, I think her policies are horrible, but she is very good at engaging in a personal way with both her voters and a much broader audience in her case. And I think that our candidates who use social media the most effectively are doing that. And just as an example, the president, love or hate his tweeting, he's engageable, it's shareable, it's personal, and people engage with that regularly. And I think it's on that same type of level, it's making that connection, whether it's through a 30-second video or a funny post about your opponent, something about yourself. Those are, I think, the best ways to engage on social media and get your message out. Because really, I think the hope is not that in that 30 seconds, they suddenly realize all your policy positions and want to, knock doors immediately in that minute, but they engage with your page, they learn more about you, and they start to build that relationship.
Yeah, and from Wisconsin, example, Senate candidate Kevin Nicholson, who is a Marine Corps veteran and really rising star, conservative star. You'll hear more about him in the future, I believe. But he was in a 4th of July parade, and it rained. And so it was just like this miserable thing, and they had staff were along, and they had video camera and stuff. And they were walking down this road, and there were a bunch of college guys that had made a water slide kind of down this hill in their backyard. And so they were like, "Come on, Kevin, come on this water slide." And so the staff person ends up chasing Kevin, going off the road, going down this like slip and slide, like water slide that's like 100 feet down, and getting soaked. I mean, it was just like, turning lemons into lemonade, like horrible kind of sort of time for a parade. Not many people out, but he goes and has fun. But they catch this digitally, and it just goes viral because it shows, right? He's personable. He's relatable. He has fun. He can connect with young voters, et cetera. And so those are the sorts of things that you want to just document who the person is. What are they doing? Who are they connecting with? How are they talking about the issues? But just how are they as a person, again, going back to how they're going to create some commonality with the voters and build upon that as young people are increasingly going to look for information online, are influenced by what they see online, what their friends in particular say online. You get a friend to share a video like that, then they start to check out, well, who is this guy? And what does he stand for? Because I saw that he likes to have fun and we'll go down a water slide. I would like to do that if I was in that parade. And so that's the sort of moments that you want to be capturing.
That's a great story. One thing I would caution a candidate is not to try to be something they're not on social media. Try to put across an image of something that they're really not. But take advantage of their strengths and make posts that show you that you care about your community, that you're involved in your community, out doing things, and that it's not about you, and it's about how we're going to make the community better. And those are usually, and I would caution candidates not to necessarily mention their opponent. Mitch said something about contrasting themselves with their opponent, but maybe not mention the opponent, but just show their positive side, and that, remember, you're trying to get people to like you and trust you, and those are your main goals as a candidate.
Great. So, Conor, I have a question specifically for you, and I'm kind of interested in too, so I'm glad somebody asked it. But what are some productive strategies when coaching a candidate to appeal to the middle, right? Because those are the voters that you need to get. Yep. There's folks who can kind of, Mitch talked about, bipartisan criminal justice reform. Most issues don't come in that bipartisan way. People are pretty tribalized about where they stand. So how do you coach candidates, Matt, too, to kind of appeal to those folks who aren't strongly on one side or the other?
Yeah, so this one kind of fits in with the digital question as well, at least from a data standpoint, is what data allows you to do is really kind of put people into groups, is people that they're interested in this. We make our predictive analytics algorithms, make suggestions, make our best guesses of where they stand on an issue. So we can start putting people in groups. If someone really scores really high on a ballot models or on an issue model somewhere, we know we can coach our candidates. Let's not talk about this. This is not the type of thing that we want to be able to get in the middle. It's something that's going to push someone one way or the other. Let's find some issues that people are in the middle that then we can have a message that they'll respond to and will actually move them a little bit at a time. That's kind of what we're looking for. And one of the ways we do this with our candidates, we talk about using social media and data, is being able to target on a one-to-one on Facebook and Google and a lot of different places to target those individual voters. We're not targeting groups of people. We're not targeting women 18 to 35. We're targeting 287 women that are between the age of 18 and 45 that actually believe this issue is very important to them, would move them. So let's talk about these specific things to specific people, and using data that allows us to make the best guess about what we believe this person cares about is kind of the best way to start. So really start in the middle and then kind of work your way out with kind of some of the bigger issues. But find something that you can actually connect with the voter with, and that's what kind of the modeling can help you do, and deliver that message to the best medium. A lot of people, like we were saying earlier, people you can't get them on their doors. They won't answer their door. They're not home. They're not going to answer their phone call, but maybe they're going to see your Facebook message. Maybe they're going to see your online digital post. Let's make sure we're delivering that message, that kind of easy message, to whichever best way to actually contact that person is.
Yeah, I think it's finding the issues that you have as much appeal with people all across the political spectrum on. So going to the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, Brian Hagedorn was attacked early on in the campaign. He had helped to found a Christian school. He was a homeschooled dad, and they created basically a part-time Christian school, and that Christian school had Christian standards of faith. I know that may be a shocker that they actually had standards, but the media got a hold of this and said, well, you're a bigot. You want to ban gays, you want to ban these groups of people, you want to ban all this. And so it just created this firestorm on the left that was attacking him story after story. And this actually turned off conservative business donors. The Chamber of Commerce backed out. You had the Realtors Association endorse Brian Hagedorn and then take their endorsement back and then defend it for multiple weeks in the press. It was just atrocious. And they were trashing him because of a Christian stance, helping a community, helping a group of students in their community. So what they did was very smart. They reframed the issue. It's not that I hate this group or hate that group of people. No, this is what actually you're doing is imposing a religious test. You're saying that I have to believe your view and I have to reject my historical standards of Christian faith that have been followed for many, many thousands of years, right? And so he reframed it as you're creating an unconstitutional religious test that's an attack on my Christian faith. Now, this resonated with voters all across the spectrum. Brian Hagedorn didn't need the business communities and the big donors. He needed the grassroots, the people of faith, the Christians that backed him. But he had to get that message out. He knew that if he reframed it as, should there be a religious test, and should Christians even be eligible to be a judge because someone that maybe has a different view than a Christian, or as a Christian maybe views something slightly differently, has different theology, does that mean it's unfair to that litigant if they would come before a judge like that, or a case would come before that judge? Well, a judge's job is not to look at someone and say, well, my personal views are that you're not going to win. No, the judge looks at the law and interprets the law, follows the rule of law, follows the Constitution, applies the law to the facts. And so Judge Hagedorn was able to make a great case and really reframe that whole issue and make an appeal. And no doubt there were Democrat Christians that turned out to vote for him. He wins by 5,900 votes. Now we're pending a recount in Wisconsin. You know how those things can go. So I don't want to say it's completely final yet. But that's an example of reframing an issue to a wider audience where 90%, I would say, of people would agree that, yes, Christians can be judges and there should be no religious test. Now, there may be a small group of people that disagree with that, but most people are going to agree with that. So candidates need to find those issues where we can have commonality and reach out to people that traditionally are not with us.
I think you bring up an interesting point, too. A lot of times when candidates come under that kind of attack, they're not good at reframing it, right? Reframing the discussion. So how do you advise candidates? Sometimes those things feel difficult. They step into it, make it worse,
Yep.
right? Instead of really just taking a step back, being like, there's a different way to look at this, and let's talk to people about that.
Yeah, we can look at the Virginia governor as an example of how to not reframe something with his infanticide and then the yearbook controversy that happened there, right? So, this is kind of crisis communications. How do you handle these things? And what it is, well, you want to be prepared for attacks before they come at the outset. So a good candidate's going to sit down with the campaign team and think through. And for Judge Brian Hagedorn, I think it helped that he knew that he had a traditional view of marriage, and he expected there'd be some attacks about traditional view of marriage because he had a blog in college where he said some things. And so he was kind of prepared for reframing things. And I would actually say the party and others didn't actually help in the response that well. But it takes time. It takes a plan. It takes stepping back from the emotion and the adrenaline and the pressure of the situation and having a sounding board, a kitchen cabinet, a group of people that you can run things off of. It's looking at the data too, right? And analyzing how do we respond, what can we talk about. But it's not just reacting and just saying what comes to mind right away. It's trying to step back from that the best you can, and this is difficult at times. But try to do it. And make no mistake, the media is against us, right? So in this particular case, the media ran with the headline that Brian Hagedorn wants to ban gays, right? And just this ridiculous. They didn't say groups accuse him of wanting to do this. And when Brian Hagedorn, even now you see articles written about it, they say Brian Hagedorn's supporters try to reframe this issue as it's attacking his Christian faith. Well, why didn't you say that when you're talking about the left-wing groups attacking him? It's because the media is obviously biased, the fake news media, they're out to get conservatives. And we have to stand up to that We have to overcome that as candidates. So we have to do a fundamentally good job of understanding what's going on, look for the issues that we can move to. And sometimes it's not always clear what that's going to be, but we have to take a step back from, I think, the emotion of that moment and analyze and look to how we can move forward, get more people on board, and ultimately deliver our message. And sometimes we have enough money to do that, and sometimes we don't. In this particular case, left-wing groups outspent the right 3-1, but it's the power of the grassroots to stand up for what they believe in, stand up for someone's faith and not imposing religious tests. And ultimately, we were able to prevail despite the odds and despite the media and despite the left-wing attacks because we had truth on our side.
So you've mentioned grassroots a couple times and talking about the Wisconsin race, right? He didn't need the kind of big political donors. He needed the grassroots. I think we saw in 2016 the power of grassroots and you know, what they can do when they're sort of having a different discussion than we're having up here. So what does happen when the conversation is up here and the grassroots is down here? How does that engagement help drive, whether it's a policy or an election, at the grassroots level that isn't being captured, Conor, in particular, in the data, or just even the way the campaign might be wanting to look at things?
You know, I think it's very important to make sure your grassroots team is informed and understand the strategy behind the campaign. I think that's one of the things that I noticed when I was on the grassroots side of things, that I always made sure our team actually understood why we were doing something. And I think that's something always kind of got lost for a lot of the grassroots would be out there and kind of feeling like you're on this island because you're not getting really necessarily all the information you need, support. And the one thing that we always make sure is anything that we're doing from a strategic level needs to be done, executed on a tactical level. So all the ideas and the messaging that we have, make sure this all filters down to our people on the ground and they have the assets they need. So when they are knocking doors, when they're having conversations, they actually know who they're talking to and what they should be talking to about. And I think that really creates this whole kind of program when you include digital and the whole aspect into it. Each one has its own place, and they all reinforce each other. So when you see on TV your ads talking about our issues, and then later on that day someone knocks on their door talking about the same thing to that voter, and they're getting an email and a digital post, they're seeing something all about those same things. It delivers the same message together at the same time in unison. I think that's one thing that really data is really good at powering. Because if you base everything off of your audiences that you build, then you actually know who's getting what treatment at what time, and you can measure that. You can actually see the impact that volunteers and grassroots teams have on your overall message. And being able to quantify that really helps the whole campaign to understand what direction it's going in.
So we've got just a couple minutes left, and this audience, many folks in this audience, you guys are the grassroots. You are the people who engage in your communities and knock on doors and help support candidates. So Lois, I'm going to start with you in the 2 minutes we have left. What is it that you want people to do when they leave here to have a new conversation in a way that they've not been having up to this point?
Well, I think the most important thing is when you start to talk to a person that you're not really sure exactly where they're coming from, if you're going to talk about an issue or an election, is just to be open to listening and to try to have your end goal in mind, trying to come up with a common denominator of something that ties you together, that you have a commonality with, that you can agree upon. Because it's hard to go forward with a person in a conversation if you can't find some level of agreement. And that could be just on the end result, and we have different ways of getting there. But we all have something in common. Hopefully we all want a better world. We want to preserve our liberties and the future of our great country, and we can start from there and then discuss, you know, if nothing else, you know, different ways we're going to get there. And over time, maybe with that person, maybe, you know, if you're willing to listen to them, maybe at some point they'll be willing to listen to you as well.
Yeah, and I would say just individuals, tell a story. Why are you supporting a candidate? Think about that, and why are you supporting a policy? Being able to tell a story about that, right? So for me, I'm a homeschool dad, or I'm an adoptive father. This is why I'm pro-life. I see, you know, the infanticide stuff that Planned Parenthood's pushing, and I think of my daughter who we adopted from China. She was neglected. She was abandoned. And that's basically what they're trying to do with babies that are born alive that they tried to abort. They just want to abandon them. Well, that motivates me to want to stand up and say, no, that's wrong, right? We care for those children. Those children are valuable. We want to save those children. So it's just being able to tell stories like that.
I think it comes down to win over hearts, get on the values, get people to agree with you on those core issues, win over those hearts, and then they'll start to agree with you more on the facts when they examine it critically.
And because of the data side of this, if you were talking to people, please collect that information. I mean,
Excellent.
Enter it into the i360 portal or whatever you use. Save that data. It is so useful. It helps everyone else out. If you are knocking doors in a certain part of your town or your state, collecting that data can be used by other people, can inform the data, can inform us all to make better decisions down the road.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for your time. Thank our panelists for joining us this morning.